I think that the first thing artists have to do is to start telling the truth. Just like climate change 5 or 6 years ago, you just didn't really want to talk about it. You got shunned in polite company if you talked about it. Now we have the C word, right? We've got collapse. But the conversation hasn't started yet. And I think just broadly speaking, the artistic community, the best of the artistic community has always been on the edge, right? The social edge, pushing, complaining, challenging, resisting.
Justice.
Yeah. But I think that's still a minority of the artistic world, really. I mean, the artistic world, a lot of it is still stuck in this whole notion of elitist collecting and acquisition, right? And how much money is that worth?
And the European canon and...
Yeah, all that.
All right, well, maybe start at the beginning, Peter, and tell us what this farm does. And
I mean, I came here originally as an idealistic, 23-year-old wanting to build an education center to sort of correct for what I perceived were the inadequacies of my own education. So now it's been 20 years of me sort of self-educating and trying to build a place that could do that. And I guess it is doing that at this point. But there's a lot of potential different angles. What it's turned into for me is developing relationships with the things that are here and the things that I've brought here, and trying to figure out which of those relationships I guess uses the least amount of energy, I guess you could say, and has the most legs as far as being something that people can rely on further into the future, past the era of now, cheap oil, so to speak. So a lot of my work has to do with setting up those systems and those relationships that'll hopefully outlive us and support other people in the future. Yeah.
How did you get into this lifelong interest in environmental issues and museums? How do those two connect, and where did it come from?
Yes, that's going back in time, because I've been in the museum business now for about 48 years. But I go back to when I started out as an archaeologist, and I was doing my field work in the Western Canadian subarctic, studying the culture history of the Dene people. And I did a lot of field work, but in those days, the Western scientific tradition didn't think that talking to local people about where they knew the archaeological sites were or about their culture was really on. Of course, we were Western scientists, we were senior graduate students, we had all the answer. And I came back after my second season of field work in the bush and realized that was completely wrong, because I was going to be spending 5 years writing a PhD about the cultural history of the Dene people, and I didn't know any of them personally. So my wife Priscilla and I dropped out of graduate school for half a year, and we spent that time near the Arctic Circle living with 5 traditional hunting families, and about 40 people or so, ranging in age from about 6 months all the way up to about 88 years old. And it's there that I learned the meaning of social ecology, that you can't separate cultural affairs from the natural environment, that they're inextricably linked together. But I also learned all sorts of other things that have always stood me in stead as a museum director, volunteer, author, editor. And that was this notion that stems from the idea of small group culture, where you share values and beliefs. And leadership is based on respect and competence, not hierarchy. There's a big emphasis on self-organization. If somebody can do a certain task better than others, then that person is nominally in charge. And there was always that fluidity, no hierarchy. There is a great emphasis on generosity. So that work with Indigenous people has stood with me too, and it has really sort of shaped my career. And I ended up here now. I think also because I was reading lately that Latin American, this is in a book, Latin American activists believe that if we need to get anything done, you got to work within the system, you got to work against the system, and you got to work beyond the system. So I'm still very much involved in the museum system as a writer and a speaker, advisor and a mentor and an elder. But I also consider this farm outside the system. As you saw today, this isn't a sort of run-of-the-mill operation. And there are values here and long-term commitments here that I think need to be nurtured so that we do have some more sort of optimistic paths to the future. And I think farms like this with no industrial input, based on intimate knowledge of the land and growing your own food, are critically important to the survival of our species.
I was saying that it's very sensual, bordering on erotic, to have so many fruit that we can eat, the raspberries, and pull them off. It seems unreal, like a...
It's like Garden of Eden sort of stuff.
Right,
Yeah.
that's what I was going to say. And what does one do in the Garden of Eden? Well...
Work really hard.
Just keep eating.
So how would you encapsulate the intention of the book? I mean, overall, what is your goal, this idea of museums as a lifeboat?
Well, I guess first, interesting to hear you say that you felt the book was a bit devastating, because I have got some comments
At
to
first,
that
anyway.
effect. Yeah, but I had to do that in the beginning. I worked on about probably 650 references, but I had to set the stage. And if we tell the truth now, setting the stage is a very negative experience, because we're in the midst of this huge polycrisis. And now 4 tipping points have already been reached. 2 of the Antarctic ice sheets are melting. The Amazon is turning into a carbon producer rather than a carbon sink. And now we have the threat to the North Atlantic current, which, if it actually transpires and shuts down, northern Europe will start to experience another ice age. So the signals are just so brazen and loud, but ostensibly ignored by most of our arts and culture colleagues. So I had to lay out that case. But then the second half of the book, I really tried to be constructive. And I think that what I would really like people to do in our business is to ask 4 questions and answer them. Now, these 4 questions aren't mine, and you'll recognize these because you listen to Jem Bendall, the founder of the Deep Adaptation Forum, and he's posed 4 questions, and I think these fit the museum world and the arts world really conveniently. What is worth keeping? Well, in the museum world, museums are worth keeping because they nurture social capital. They nurture relationships of trust and collegiality and honesty and dependence and interdependence amongst their visitors. That idea of social capital is going to be absolutely key if society begins to unravel. And I think the museums are a major source of that social capital. Also, museums are seed banks. Of all the things we've accomplished as civilization, the good and the bad, and we are going to need intimate knowledge of those seeds as modern techno-industrial society begins to wind down and all our fossil fuel dependencies become unstuck. So those are just 2 examples of what we need to keep. So what's worth keeping is one of these questions. What must we get rid of? What can we bring back? And I think what we can bring back is starting with asking the question, why? Why are you creating art? Why are you making art? Why does your museum exist? That question of why seldomly gets asked. It's always, what are we going to do? Or how are we going to do it? But very few strategic plans in museums actually ask and answer the question of why.
Yeah, I have like a mixed sort of relationship with that concept of hope, because I actually genuinely have very little hope for the continuation of humanity. But then at the same time, every day I'm out here making bigger ponds and planting trees that I think will do better, and trying to bring on board people with the same ideas and visions. So it's a bit of a contradiction, I guess, for me.
It's called life.
Yeah. So yeah, I make a personal effort towards hope, but I don't feel any hope. I guess you could say
It's
that.
really easy to be hopeless. And I suppose it's rather contradictory to say hopeless, but still want to do things constructively to overcome that hopelessness. And so I guess that's what I mean. There's so many things we can do. We know what we need to do to weather this storm. But I guess the sacrifice and the suffering it's going to cause is just too much for people's imagination. So there's middle ground with all that. And again, this farm is a source of being helpful, and I guess underneath that being hopeful, and a source of being what was the mantra? It's hopeless but not helpless. Yeah. And the farm for me is that tool, it's that environment, it's the context to do helpful things and to pave the way for the future. Well, I wonder how regeneration now figures into permaculture, because that's the latest catchword, right? It's regenerative work.
Yeah, it could or couldn't, depending, I think, but probably usually does.
Uh-huh.
Regenerative being the idea, how is that different from just regular farming?
You're not taking away, you're being conscious of putting in too, like Peter's been talking about. It's not just an extractive sort of thing. It's developing healthy relationships with the land and the animals and the plants.
But the regenerative livestock people are all about adding carbon to the soil. I think that's the main thing they're trying to do, is increase soil health and carbon holding capacity.
And it seems to me there's a growing consensus of opinion that that's going to happen in localized efforts. It may not happen in these big urban environments, but it may happen on a place like Denman Island. It may happen in all these other small collectives, all these small family farms, all these intentional communities. I think that's where the future lies. But it's going to be a hardship because most of the world's people can't participate in those sort of things. Artists, I think, can generally become advocates for the planet in whatever sort of work they're doing. Because I don't think there's any really sort of revolutionary methods or artistic techniques that haven't already been discovered. It's the message that's important now. And that message is telling the truth. And that is, we've got to repair this rupture between nature and culture. And artists really are in a key position to do that, because if you really look at the history of museum work, they've largely failed to do that. In fact, most of the world's 95,000 museums, if they aren't natural history museums and science museums, and even those are committing this mistake, they separate nature and culture. They don't present the interconnectedness. They don't really practice social ecology. And that's been a big failing, right? Because that underlies the whole modern techno-industrial society, that we can treat this forest any way we want to. We can extract whatever we want continuously until it's dead. And again, as I said, if these tipping points all open up and happen, it may be too late. But we still have to keep that optimism, right? As you described, we have to do what we can do now. But it is a wild card, and it's not climate change. I think it's the loss of biodiversity, because I think the climate crisis is just a symptom of our overconsumption and our wastage, loss of biodiversity. We don't have to worry about saving the world, the planet. It's our civilization that we need to save, right? Mother Nature will take care of herself one way or another. She's hurting, but she'll take care of herself. It's you and me that we have to worry about.
Oh, you'll attract them.
They're the most pretentious animals ever.
The most what?
Pretentious.
What do they pretend to be?
They just have a lot of attitude.
I feel extremely sad about what's happened, and I think that sadness has really come home to roost, because here we are in the farm and we have our 5th grandchild. She's 5 months old. What is her life going to be like? And that causes me to be sad, because our generation, the baby boom generation, has used 50% of the world's resources. So it's pretty hard to deny that responsibility. But I also feel empowered to do constructive things, this farm. And I feel empowered when someone like you comes from the outside, walks through the farm and says, whoa, this looks interesting. This looks good. Tell me more. That's empowering. I think it's empowering for Peter too, even though he may not express it the way I do. I think we have to keep fighting. We have to resist. And that's where the artistic community comes in, because they've often resisted incredible things. I mean, just think of paintings like Picasso's Guernica, right? Where he's told the world, this is what the Nazis did to that city. He resisted and he protested. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us now to assume that responsibility by action, not just walking in a march. And I have that in my book too, the difference between real action and just protesting. We have to do both. but it's an ever-present need now because the establishment is not listening. They're carrying on with despoiling the planet for personal gain.